Hi everyone, I'm Mevindu. I used to debate at Ananda College, and today I will be doing a debrief on the round 5 motion of VVIDC 2026. Both the motion and the info slide will also be available in the description. The motion reads, "This house prefers stories from nature over religious mythology as a tool to teach morals." And the info slide reads, "From Aesop's fables to the solitary penguin, nature has given humans many valuable lessons through the lives of animals and plants." In the first section of this video, I will be discussing both setup and arguments for proposition, and it will be followed by arguments and setup for opposition. And at the end of the video, let's take a look at the weighing metrics that both sides can use in this particular debate. So firstly then, in terms of setup, I think it's important to establish the fact that in this particular debate, both sides agree on the impact of teaching morals to kids, because children are going to be like the key stakeholder in this, and you end up creating moral actors. Then this debate is about the discussion as to which of the two tools are preferable in inculcating morals to children. So on proposition, you can describe nature stories that convey morals to use living or non-living things in nature to convey this moral, right? They could be using plants, animals, etc. Whereas religious mythology perhaps evolves around like characters like deities, supernatural creations that also might vary from religion to religion, right? The gods that are in Greek mythology might not be the gods that exist in Hindu mythology, right? The hierarchy might be different, and there could be those inconsistencies from religion to religion. I think on proposition, given that the most important thing in this debate is as to how these people would extract these morals out of the story. So it's going to be children, right? So they should be able to resonate quite well with the story that's told to them. So you can establish two parameters on your side. Firstly, this idea of accessibility, and secondly, this idea of proximity, right? Proximity in the sense that how proximate or realistic is that story to these children, right? I'll extend on these things throughout my arguments as well. So two arguments that I thought of for proposition. I mean, we're doing two arguments because it's because of the limited time, but it doesn't, I mean, there are lots of other ideas that you all can bring up. So first argument, then we can talk about how religious mythology is very exclusionary when it comes to giving teaching these morals, right? So what happens is that in these kinds of, when these morals are given or when these morals are taught to children, right, now there has to exist a precondition where you have to believe in this particular religion in order to have access to the moral stories that you teach through the use of religious mythology, right? So there is an already existing buy-in. And there's another issue in this. People tend to do morals when it's taught through religious mythology, is they think that they need to do morals out of necessity or because of divine command, right? So what happens is, in the future, if they end up questioning these morals, there is going to be a problem, right? I mean, we can talk about this more in analysis. I think another thing to highlight in terms of like religious mythology is that the morals are going to be limited, right? So that's to say that, like, you know, even if you have a good moral that could be taught in a better way using mythology from a different religion, you really can't co-opt those morals because there are fundamentally inconsistencies that exist between these religions, right? So morals can't be universally and easily taught to children because of these like religious inconsistencies, right? You can extend on this a bit further, where you can talk about, like, if you think about kids, there are like two groups of kids, right? Where they probably come from like a very religious household, so their parents teach them morals in their childhood, but even when they grow up, they are unlikely to carry the same amount of adherence to this, right? What this means is, when you're subject to external influences, you are likely to question things, right? And when kids question this fact about, like, you know, authority of God or something, and if they feel like that this isn't something that is true, not only is that idea going to diminish, but also the morals are also going to diminish, because the foundation for these morals was this idea that like you do things out of like divine command, right? And secondly, you have kids who are very inquisitive in general, like from the childhood itself they pose lots of questions, right? So these kids are unlikely to buy into these morals or extract these morals, because these stories aren't as proximate to them, right? Because you talk about a god that isn't very proximate to you, right? But whereas you use an example in your immediate surrounding, like a colony of ants working together to build their get what they want to, and you teach the value of cooperation, you're more likely to buy that and you're more likely to listen to that, right? That's because that's because it's like something that's very much proximate to you, and you see that thing in like your environment, right? So that is a comparative on our side. You can like impact this further, where you can see uniquely you can frame it as how morals on-site proposition is viewed as a realistic consequence, and thus you're likely to have better moral actors. Because in the future, when religious ideals, like right now when religious ideals tend to clash with like modern secular ideals, because of this cognitive dissonance, you are put into a state where you tend to question the morals that were instilled to you when you in your childhood. And when you see those inconsistencies, you're also going to let go of your morals, and that doesn't need to happen, and that shouldn't happen, right? Because then people won't be able to do good things, right? On our side, morals are viewed as like a very logistic, realistic consequence of something that you should do, and because it's taught based off like things in nature, right? And that makes people like far better moral actors. The second argument is this idea about how people will end up loving the nature more, and the sorts of impacts that come out of it, right? So this traditional conception of morality is a very human-centered thing, right? It's the idea that humans matter the most. It's all about humans, and everything else is at their own disposal to be exploited, right? This is a very, very bad narrative that is cultivated in society, right? What changes here on proposition is that when you learn morals through nature, for example, where you learn the virtue of patience by seeing a seed grow into a plant, now you see that nature is a source of wisdom, something that taught you important morals that help shape your life, that help shape your current life, right? So you're going to treat it as a source of wisdom as opposed to exploiting it for your own gains, right? And in addition to that, the factor of empathy also grows, right? Because as stated in the info slide, in the solitary penguin story, basically the penguin is portrayed as a hero, right? So that means you understand the capability of other species in nature itself, and you're more likely to extend your empathy to species beyond your own self, right? And those things are important. I think the way that you can impact this is, right now, like a massive issue that people face in current society is the climate crisis, and that is amplified by human activities, and no one does anything to stop that, right? And the root cause for this is in fact the destruction of nature. But on our side, given that nature is viewed in a very holistic manner, something that was instrumental in shaping their lives, this sense of like environmental stewardship is going to be promoted on our side of the house. And you can talk about how it's easy to rally people to get support to these kinds of courses to preserve the environment, all of those things, right? Okay, now let's move on to opposition. On opposition, what you'd want to establish in setup is the idea that the morals that you gain out of stories based on nature tends to be like trivial, or that doesn't address like serious concerns or serious dilemmas that people face, and also extend to talk about how the moral networks that are taught through nature are sometimes not very fruitful, right? So this is to say that like when you talk about religious mythology, it isn't just the idea that you talk about deities and supernatural beings. It's the heroic emulation that people get after listening to these stories. That is what pushes people to do good even if the world is very unfair to them. These kinds of situations aren't really catered to when you talk about morals through examples in nature, right? And the other thing that you can highlight in setup is that morals never ever existed in a vacuum, right? It always connects to culture and heritage, right? So morals are essential in sort of carving that cultural identity of people, and religious mythology has a unique advantage over, like, stories based of nature in this prospect, right? Let's talk about these a bit more in the arguments. So I think the first argument is where you can talk about how people have access to a more sophisticated, complex moral network when they learn this out of religious mythology, right? The intuition here is simple. It's the idea that nature has always been about this notion of survival of the fittest, right? It isn't a very fair moral system, right? So for example, right, um, uh, in nature, a lion killing a deer is fine because it's satisfying its hunger, right? But this is quite problematic in the sense that, like, you don't talk about things where you give mercy for the weak. Those sorts of advanced human values, those kinds of things aren't perpetuated through nature, right? Because there are those complex moral dilemmas that people face, and they are uniquely important in shaping the lives of people, right? um, this thing that I want to highlight is that idea. For example, like in nature, like the stories that you see out of nature tend to be like very linear and like very simple, right? So again, this example of a colony of ants working together. So ants work together, therefore ants become successful, right? That's a very that's a good notion, true, but it's a very shallow surface level thing, right? Because people tend to face way more complex situations where it's very hard for you to make these kinds of decisions. But on the flip side, where you talk about like religious mythology, where you have like the stories of Jesus, or even in Buddhism, where you talk about the great renunciation of Lord Buddha, all of these shows how people could act in critical situations where you have two competing yet very important concerns, and once you're subject to that kind of a situation, how exactly do you work your way around that, right? Those kinds of unique like things are obtained through religious mythology. So the impacting here is to say that, like, people face situations where there isn't a clear or determined biological winner, and those situations are very much abundant in the human world, and therefore you need a very complex moral network that can only be accessed through like religious mythology. The second idea is about culture and morality, right? Like I said, morality doesn't exist in a vacuum, right? It's connected to culture, and your cultural identity is important when you grow up, right? So for example, Ramayana or like stories of Jesus, they aren't mere depictions of history, right, and mere depictions of religion. It connects the children to their ancestors, right? There is some sense of heritage, and that gives a strong cultural rooting that people have. You don't get this thing from nature because you talk about trees or animals. That is something that is abundant and available everywhere. You don't feel a unique sense of attachment, or you don't get that like unique cultural cohesion that on through those kinds of stories, right? So what that does is to say that on our side, you can impact this further, where you have a world where morals aren't just about do's and don'ts, but it's also about a system that influences the culture around us, right? The practices that people keep on doing, cultural practices, even if they might not have a logistic meaning, people still do those things because that's essential to shape the society, our relationships and everything, and that is what formulates the cultural identity, right? And therefore morals are important in that prospect. So then finally, let's talk about a few weighing metrics. This is metrics in general for both sides, right? So on proposition, you can talk about this idea of accessibility, right? How accessible is are religious morals to all people in general? There is always a precondition where you need to follow a certain faith in order to listen to those doctrines, and then maybe teach these stories to children, and therefore them to buy that in order, right? And then there's this idea of proximity, right? People always question things that they haven't seen, like gods and all of those things. Not every person is willing to believe these kinds of things, but when they're given something that is far more proximate to them, something that they can see in their day-to-day lives, they are more willing to listen to those kinds of things, right? So you could use those metrics in order to solidify your case on side of proposition. However, like on opposition, you can talk about the quality of morals, right? Sure, nature also tells you, teaches you a bunch of morals using different examples you see in your day-to-day life, but they tend to be very linear, quite simple ones, right? People deal with like far more complex situations that require that rigor in morals, and that can only be achieved when you listen to these kinds of, when you listen to, or rather understand morals through religious mythology based stories, right, as we discussed above. But finally, you can also talk about morals, right? This goes for both sides, right? What exactly is the intention of morals? I mean, do you always do morals out of necessity, or do you attempt to do things out of aspiration, right? Because I mean, I know this is quite intuitive on top to say that on side opposition it's because of divine command you tend to do these things, but also on opposition you can argue that, like, you are likely to do things that are counterintuitive, right? Like, showing mercy for the weak, higher values like forgiveness for people who have done wrong, and you tend to aspire to do good things because you've seen great figures in these religious mythology based stories, right? What these great figures do is, because of this heroic emulation that you get out of seeing these figures, you are likely to stand out in the world even if the world is unfair to you, right? So you can flip the claim that Prop is bringing, that you tend to do things out of necessity, which isn't necessarily true. There's always room for you to do things out of aspiration, uniquely on your side of the house, which is an added benefit. That's it for this video. Thanks for listening.